Welcome everybody to the course. The handout that I sent around on the chat is available on the website also. In a minute or two, I'll send it around because I see people are still joining us. The principal point of the handout, you will have noticed it looms large on the website, is the mandala of metavocabularies. This course comes with a meditation aid, and that's it. I'd be glad if we would stare at that a little bit. Here is the mandala. Mostly what I'm going to do today is explain what that thing means. But it's structuring everything we're going to talk about, at least in the first 9 or 10 weeks of the course. So I hope to fill it in so that it becomes more and more meaningful as time goes on. I don't by any means think that it's self-explanatory, but I'm going to try and make it mean something to us. So this is a course advertised as being a course in the philosophy of language. And that's what it is, but it's an unusual course in the philosophy of language. Usually, a course under that heading, we would look at some specific topics, at comparatives, at epistemic modals, at different uses of conditionals, and so on. We are eventually going to drill down to that sort of level of detail, but not for a while. I want to start with big questions because I think contemporary philosophers of language are too content to work within an inherited framework of questions and concepts and assumptions about the relations between the answers to different questions. And the principal virtue of the framework that I'm going to be presenting over the next weeks is that it's an alternative. It's suggesting that one can gain from thinking about the principal topics as hanging together in a different way than the tradition has done. And I'll try and show some of the concrete benefits that accrue if one does adopt this alternate framework. And to put the basic idea in a nutshell, it is that to ask the question, what is language, is another way of asking the question, what are reasons? And I'm going to be, inter alia, defending the outrageous and now outmoded claim that Michael Dummett made, that philosophy of language is first philosophy. It's the core of philosophy, on the basis that concern with reasons is at the center of the philosophical enterprise, and that language is the medium of reasons, and reasons are the heart of language. So this is going to be a reason-centered approach to language, but because it is, it shows in a way I think more traditional views don't, the myriad of connections between the philosophy of language specifically and other philosophical concerns, really everywhere where the notion of reasons applies. Send that handout around again. So looking, here's the view from 10,000 feet up, before we've even gotten to the mandala there. What is language, we ask? We want to understand discursive practices. That is a term I'll use to comprise talking and thinking, but in the sense of apperception, consciousness in the sense of sapience rather than sentience. That is, being able to say or think that things are thus and so, where the thus and so specifies a propositional content. Won't be using the notion of proposition, but the notion of the kind of content that's expressed by declarative sentences, that's at the fore. We're going to understand that kind of content as what can serve as a reason and endorsement of which can stand in need of a reason. So that there's going to be an intimate connection between the notion of reasons, reasoning, passing, giving a reason for something else, and discursive practice. Sentience is being aware in the sense of being awake. And that's something we share with a great number of our fellow non-human animals, whereas discursiveness, at least in the full-blown sense, is, so far as we know, unique to us, though we Kantians are concerned about discursiveness as such, not just specifically human discursiveness, if that's a distinction we can make. So that's one of the features of Kantianism, is they think, yes, it makes sense to talk about rational animals in general, even if we turn out to be the only kind there is, as a matter of contingent fact. So, a course in the philosophy of language, but the subtitle is Metavocabularies of Reason. And that's what the mandala is supposed to indicate. Again, like the mandala itself, I'm not claiming that that means anything right away, but we'll see that each of the subsidiary questions we can ask under the general rubric, what is language, will come with a kind of metavocabulary. I use the term metavocabulary rather than meta-language for reasons I'll get to later on. It's a more I mean it as a more capacious sort of notion. There are languages are vocabularies, but there are vocabularies that are merely fragments of languages. So, for instance, if we ask what is language, one of the questions we could ask is, what is discursive practice? What is linguistic practice? What distinguishes it from non- or pre-discursive, pre-linguistic practices? This is a question of pragmatics in the broad sense of asking about the use of language. When we think about pragmatics, the study of the use of the language, one of the big divides is whether one thinks about that pragmatics in terms of social practices or in terms of individual abilities. These are both important topics. They interact in interesting ways. I'll be arguing we ought to start with the notion of discursive practices and think about the abilities that individuals need to master in order to play the role they play in the practices, rather than thinking of the abilities as prior in the order of explanation and the practices as somehow merely displaying the discursive abilities. But that's a substantive philosophical claim. It's a substantive methodological commitment. It's something we'll need to say something about. Particularly today, I'm not assembling these considerations in the form of arguments for particular claims. I'm just sort of describing how I see the ground, staking out position. That study, Pragmatics, we can ask, well, what language should we use to describe the use of the language, the social practices, or indeed the, in a secondary sense, the abilities? That's to ask a question about pragmatic metavocabularies. And like the other metavocabularies we'll look at, pragmatic metavocabularies are a specific form of self-consciousness, a particular way of understanding ourselves as discursive beings, is to think about what it is to use linguistic expressions in the way that we do. But we can also ask, besides asking about use, we can ask about meaning. That's the topic, in a broad sense, of semantics, where pragmatics, in a broad sense, is the study of the use of the expressions. Semantics is the study of the meanings. And we can ask, in the same spirit, what features a semantic metavocabulary ought to have. Now, we'll see on the pragmatic side, I'll claim there's rather a lot we can say about the particular alternatives for pragmatic metavocabularies. I'll urge that we want to use normative vocabulary in our pragmatic metavocabularies. When we ask that question on the side of semantics, it's a question about what the semantically relevant whatsitses are that, by associating them with expressions, we offer a theory of the meaning of the expressions. Insofar as you're interested in philosophical semantics and not just formal semantics, you don't just want to know what are these semantic interpretants, what kinds of thing are they? Are they sets of possible worlds? Are they truth makers and false makers? What are those things? But also, how do they get associated with our expressions? How is it that they become attached to the expressions as the semantic interpretants of those expressions? And what I'm calling a pragmatist methodological commitment is to the idea that that's going to be specified in the pragmatic metavocabulary, that's doing philosophical semantics. It takes place in a pragmatic metavocabulary, a theory of the use of the language. Wittgenstein never said meaning is use. He said things like, don't look to the meaning, look to the use. One thing we can be sure of is that meaning isn't use. They're related in fundamental ways. I take it that he was, by these remarks, directing our attention to the use rather than to the meaning, was endorsing this kind of pragmatist order of explanation and saying, well, look at what it is about the use in virtue of which linguistic expressions have the meanings that they do. We can ask the question, what is logic? It's not obvious to begin with what that has to do with the question, what is language? Again, there's different traditional answers to the question of what the relations between logic and language is. In the arc of the course, we're going to move around the vertices of the triangle from thinking about pragmatics thinking about logic, thinking about semantics. But what's distinctive about the metalinguistic rationalism that I'll be developing and presenting is the idea that understanding the relation between these different kinds of metavocabularies requires thinking about reasons and what I'll call reason relations, that all of them are metavocabularies for expressing aspects of reason-giving reason relations. So the most basic question that's raised from this point of view by asking what is language is what are reasons? And metalinguistic rationalism is the view that to answer that question, one should look at the relations among these different metavocabularies for specifying the reason relations, in virtue of which expressions are properly used the way they are. That's a pragmatic matter. Expressions have the meanings that they do. That's a semantic matter. And that those reasons can be codified in a logical language. I haven't said anything much about that. So the question one should ask on this metalinguistic rationalist point of view, downstream from asking what is language, is what are reasons? And to try and understand that from the point of view of these different metavocabularies for specifying them. Now, let me say something else about the shape of the course. For the last decade, this reasons first approach to language, and particularly to logic and semantics, has animated the efforts of an international logic group, Research on Logical Expressivism, ROLE, that I helped organize about a decade ago. We began with the aspiration to develop a new, distinctly expressivist approach to logically codifying reason relations, and spread out from there to what turned out to be neighboring regions of semantics and pragmatics. Now, though many people have contributed to this enterprise, and we will be reading some of their contributions by the others along the way, the principal people who've made the most progress in this, in articulating this reasons first approach to language, logic, and semantics are Ulf Lobel and Dan Kaplan, both of whom are Pitt PhDs. Ulf is a grown-up. He's a tenured professor at Concordia, wrote his dissertation with me now some years ago. Dan Kaplan is newly minted. He defended his dissertation in December and is now doing a postdoc in Concordia with Ulf. And the two of them are writing a book presenting a reasons first approach to logic and semantics that they've graciously included me in as a third author. Essentially, all of the technical results in that book are due to them. That's why it's their book. But because I've been concerned to describe the framework in which we can see these technical achievements as philosophically significant in the way that we do, I've been providing the sort of glue for their boards, the mortar for their bricks. So we're writing this book. It's well along, but we don't have the manuscript of the whole thing, called Reasons for Logic, Logic for Reasons. It'll come out from Routledge. And basically, this course is me taking the opportunity to tell the story of that book the way I would tell it, which is a little bit different than the way Ulf and Dan would and indeed will tell it. Though, we'll be reading their tellings, their settings out of their results. And indeed, they've graciously agreed to guest star in the seminar. They'll each be here for one of the times when we talk about their work. So this course is presenting, well, a Pitt product. They say that they're Pitt PhDs who worked with me here, but have been working in this larger group as well. It's potentially of interest, I think, just to see what, for instance, Dan's work in logic and semantics that came out in that recent dissertation are. But as a result, though I'm telling this story, when we get down from the view from 10,000 feet to looking at the details by and large are due to Ulf and Dan. Specifically, what we're going to see as we post hole in the three vertices and the middle of the mandala there is a specific pragmatics that develops Greg Restall and Dave Ripley's normative bilateralist interpretation of the logical implication turnstile of multi-sequence sequent calculi. That may well have sounded like gibberish. You have to trust me that I will tell you what you need to know about these sort of post-holdings. But that's a very specific pragmatic metavocabulary that we'll end up exploring. There's a specific view about the structure of reason relations, distinguishing material reason relations, as it were, the reason relations that articulate ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, ground level vocabulary, from the structural features of specifically logical reasons. In particular, that says that ordinary reason relations are non-monotonic and non-transitive. Not always, but they are not always monotonic and transitive as purely logical reason relations are. So the question comes, well, what sort of metavocabulary can we use to talk about these, from the traditional point of view, substructural reason relations? And in particular, what logical language could one use to codify consequence relations and relations of incompatibility that have this open textured structure instead of the closure structure that purely logical relations of consequence and incompatibility have. And Ulf and Dan between them have a surprisingly intuitive and well-behaved logic codifying non-monotonic and non-transitive reason relations. And on the side of semantics, having come all around clockwise around the mandala, from pragmatics to logic to semantics, Dan has adapted Girard's phase space semantics for linear logic to give a general implication space semantics, which is the fulfillment of all the dreams this semantic inferentialist ever had in a long life. It's what I've always dreamed of and more. I couldn't do it, but Dan did it. It's transformative, and one of the things on offer in the course is I'll sort of explain how it works. He proves this open textured structural logic that he has sound and complete with respect to this semantics. Ulf shows an absolutely astonishing isomorphism between the bilateralist, or our version of the bilateralist pragmatist semantic, pragmatic metavocabulary, Dan's implication space semantics, and the most sophisticated and powerful contemporary version of possible world semantics, namely Kit Fine's hyper-intentional truth-maker semantics. And again, if you don't know the Kit Fine semantics, I'll tell you what you need to know. If you look in those sections, you'll see I've linked to the basic Kit Fine article. And what Ulf's result shows, I will claim, is the way all these metavocabularies for reason relations are related to one another. And that's sort of the punchline of the course. So there's two overviews of this project available in links on the course webpage. One of them is the draft manuscript called On the Structure of Reasons, Pragmatics, Semantics, and Logic. That was my first try through all this material. It's about 120 pages long, so not asking you to sit down and read it. It's in there in the supplementary readings. But if you are interested, or if you get interested, that was my first try through in an overview of this material. It was in thinking about that we realized, hey, we were actually in a position to write a book, pulling all this stuff together. And the other sort of overarching source is the various chapter drafts of Reasons for Logic, Logic for Reasons, but in particular the introduction that I wrote, which is an overview introducing the material in the book. You'll find that link under week 4 when we'll worry about it. But if you wanted to look beforehand, that to see what's on offer, that's another place you can go. I should say, keep up with the, at least look in on the course website. It's sort of under construction. I try to keep it so all the links are live, and so you can jump ahead if you're curious about anything. But I am going to be shifting things around, and so you can't be sure that it's going to stay sort of just the same. I think it's basically what we want to do, but as we go along, things will change. One thing is I looked at it 5 minutes before we set the class. I put the wrong time on the website for it. It says 1:30 instead of 1 o'clock. How many hours I put in on this thing staring at it, didn't see that. Well, I will fix that. Okay, so that's a quick path through sort of what we're going to do in the first 9 or 10 weeks of the course. I'll say something later about what I think we'll do in the last portion of it. That's more speculative because it goes beyond what's in this forthcoming sort Pitt student book that we have. So let me return to the original question, stepping back a little from this particular constellation of commitments about it, the metalinguistic rationalism that I'll be developing, and just say something about the question of what language is. And let me start by mentioning some things that I won't talk about, that you might well think one would talk about in such a course. And the first is syntax. I mean, if you ask a linguist, what is a language? Downstream from Chomsky, you're going to get an answer about generative grammars, the generativeness of grammars. You're going to get a syntactic answer. And I'm not going to talk about that at all. Indeed, we're not going to talk about anything smaller than a sentence. The logic we'll be looking at is purely propositional logic, though it can be extended to a first order one, but that extension doesn't matter for the things we need from it. The semantics is a semantics for propositional expressions. Again, it can be extended, but it doesn't matter for the purposes we need. We can think about reasons as essentially indissoluble units. So in the logic, we will, of course, look at logical operators that form sentences from sentences, propositional operators, but we won't look at any subsentential structure that isn't itself capable of being used as a sentence. I mean, you might think propositional logic, boring. What are you going to do? No, it's not boring. It's difficult and exciting. So anyway, I'm not going to talk about the Chomskyan stuff. If the result of the story I tell is to pick out, to demarcate languages in an important sense, then there'll be a question, well, what does that have to do with the sense that a linguist downstream from Chomsky would appeal to syntax and a sort of syntactically flavored semantics in order to pick out what's the relation between those? I'm not going to have anything to say about that, but it will be an interesting question left over then. And the other thing is, except here and there in the discussion of pragmatic metavocabularies, I'm not going to discuss the social character of social practices, the distinction between attributing a commitment to someone else and undertaking it oneself, which is at the core of the normative pragmatics of making it explicit. That's as important a feature of language as there could be, but it's not necessary to delve into that level for the story we're going to tell. So we won't. Everything that can be left out will be. Okay. If we ask the question, what is language, or what are languages, or the more general question, what are vocabularies, some of which are languages? That's a demarcational question. It's an ontological question. We're asking about a kind of thing. And a demarcation question raises the potential issue of exceptionalism. If we say how these things are different from other things, languages, discursive things, texts, even if we go deeper than sort of on beyond vocabularies, well, how different are they from everything else? Are they a completely different kind of thing in the sense that now asking a methodological or epistemological question rather than an ontological one? Are they different in that we ought to approach the systematic study of them using quite different tools than we use to study middle-sized bits of dry goods or physical things? I use the term exceptionalism here with a nod at an issue in contemporary philosophy of logic about logical exceptionalism. Tim Williamson in particular has been concerned to reject an exceptionalism about logic and say, no, the methods of logic are just the same as the methods of any empirical science. There's some specific differences, but generically we can use those same methods. Metalinguistic rationalism is a kind of exceptionalism. It says that discursive things are fundamentally different from non-discursive things. And different methodological, epistemological tools are going to be necessary. Talk about reasons and rational metavocabularies. Metavocabularies of reason is the way I'm going to be demarcating them. But exceptionalism comes with a built-in danger. And you need look no farther than biological exceptionalism in the 19th century, particularly in Germany, but it had its echoes elsewhere. Downstream from Romanticism, said, look, organisms, living organisms, are fundamentally a different kind of thing from merely physical or merely chemical kinds of things. We need to use a teleological form of explanation for them. We're not going to be able to understand them with the same methods of empirical science that had proven so successful in physics and were proving successful in chemistry. This was the cautionary lesson of vitalism. They thought they could transcendentally deduce the impossibility of 20th century molecular biology from an argument about an exceptionalist argument about the biological. And by the end of the 19th century, there was a similar exceptional, by which time vitalism was already not certainly a mainstream view anymore. But there was a corresponding exceptionalism precisely about the discursive. And here Wilhelm Diltai is a key figure, central figure in the hermeneutic tradition, started by Schleiermacher, that would go on in Germany, maybe culminating in Gadamer in nearly our time. Gadamer was 100 years old when he died, so it's taking in a lot to talk about Gadamer. But the hermeneutic view that Diltai had put forward said, look, these discursive formations, things people say, texts, idioms, they're so fundamentally different from other things that we need a different method of understanding them. He said, you can't explain meanings. Eclaren is the German word often used in the natural sciences. You need a different kind of understanding, verstehen, which basically involves interpretation or mapping of the text onto things you would yourself say in a sort of compare and contrast way, acknowledging the differences, but in a way that Diltai already thought, and this comes to thematic explicitness in Gadamer, you understand them by conversing with them, not by stating laws and giving theories about them. And this hermeneutic view, well, I keep using that word, and I'm reminded that my teacher, Rorty, said that whenever he used the word hermeneutic, he was afraid he was losing his audience, that they would think he was talking about a German philosopher whose first name was Hermann and whose last name they hadn't quite caught. This is the Schleiermacher, Diltai, Gadamer tradition of textual interpretation, hermeneutics. But it had an echo in the translational and interpretivist views of Quine and of Davidson, and in Davidson's case, saying, look, what it is for something to be meaningful, for it to be discursive, is for it to be mappable on to your way of talking in a way that makes sense to you, in the way you understand somebody else in a conversation. And that's fundamentally different from theory formulation in natural sciences. This is all downstream of, I mentioned Romanticism for the vitalists. This hermeneutic tradition is downstream from Hegel's distinction between things that have natures and things that have histories. Discursive formations are things that have histories instead of natures, which Alexander von Humboldt, when he was charged with basically inventing the modern German university, did it on Hegelian grounds and built deep into that structure a distinction between Naturwissenschaften and Geisteswissenschaften, a distinction between natural sciences and humane knowledge. Social sciences are Geisteswissenschaften, but methodologically, at least looking over their shoulder at the Naturwissenschaften, and we see disciplinary echoes of this in American universities, even though the boundaries are perennially fraught and contentious. Where do math and linguistics go? What about history, psychology? And disciplines get split over this. In the last academic generation, cultural and physical anthropology have diverged from one another based on where they wanted to be in this divide. Well, this is all to say that exceptionalism comes with dangers. One of the central animating motives of the Vienna Circle, the unity of science side of their thought, was to reject exceptionalism and say knowledge is empirical knowledge. The way you understand something is in a way that's at least continuous with the most mature empirical natural sciences. They rejected the notion of verstehen. There's a danger in adopting an exceptionalist point of view of turning a distinction into a dualism. I think a dualism is a distinction that's drawn in such terms that you can't understand the relation between the distinguished items anymore. And there's a danger that an exceptionalist position will become a dualism. And you won't be able to understand how there could, how the world could have things that could only be understood in these two radically different ways. Here's a quick story, really just some slogans about how one might be an exceptionalist without being a dualist. Davidson, who was the arch interpretivist of his philosophical generation, anyway, in Anglophone analytic philosophy, thought that what it was to be a discursive formation was to be interpretable by you here and now, that you had to use your own discursive abilities as a kind of measuring instrument to detect other such discursive formations, and that whatever practical difficulties you might have doing that, what it means to be a discursive formation is to be mappable onto your own utterances. But he also thought that didn't mean we couldn't understand them in another way. And the way he picked was recursive truth theories for their meanings. And though he never put things quite this way, I think what he was doing was, in a progressive and correct way, distinguishing a criterion of demarcation for the discursive, interpretability, what Quine talked about as having a mapping that permitted fluency of dialogue between you and the other one. That's a criterion of discursive understanding for Davidson, exceptionalist that he is. But that doesn't mean it's the only method of understanding. And he thought we could also pick out the very same things by looking at what we could give a recursive, productive truth theory for. And in making it explicit, I adopt a view like this. The criterion of being a discursive practice is ultimately that it can be mapped on to ours in a way that permits fluency of dialogue. But that doesn't mean that one can't give necessary and sufficient conditions for being interpretable in that way. Necessary and sufficient conditions that don't appeal to interpretability. And that's what we aim to do with the notion of metalinguistic rationalism, is to look at the reason relations that articulate the contents of vocabularies as those determine a distinctive constellation of metavocabularies for specifying aspects of those reasons. And the large-scale empirical claim, the overarching empirical claim is anything that has those features will be interpretable, and vice versa. That's in a broad sense, an empirical claim, but that's how an exceptionalist can avoid a dualism. Okay, those were all talked about what I wasn't going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about syntax. only talking about the level of propositions. Here was a cautionary tale about the kind of exceptionalism that we have. This is violating, telling the story in this order is violating the methodological maxim or meta-methodological axiom, where John Austin said in any philosophical story, there's the bit where you say it, and then there's the bit where you take it back. When you armor the claim so that it can withstand criticism. And the meta-methodological advice is make sure you tell the bit where you say it first. Don't do the bit where you take it back first, because your readers will never get there. And I just violated that maxim. So let me try not to. What is language? What we could call the long 20th century, sort of starting with Frege in the mid-1880s and 1890s, and stretching over into the 21st century, has strikingly, and I think evidently, been the century of language in philosophy. That's probably obvious, most obvious in the Anglophone analytic tradition, but it's equally true in the continental tradition. Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and so on. But there have been two different strands of thought, two different traditions that don't really line up with that analytic continental one. They're both strands of thought are represented on both sides of the English Channel. One is a logistical semantic formalist tradition that stretches from Frege to Russell to the Tractatus, Carnap, Tarski, Lewis, and Kit Fine could be our example of the contemporary one, that took as its model proof systems in mathematics. Its native notion of a reason is the notion of a proof. And even today, formal semantic traditions, the Tarskian model theory, possible worlds semantics, and Kit Fine's truthmaker semantics, they are true to their roots in that the first thing you do to show this is a tractable semantics is give us semantics for logic. They're looking at artificial calculi where the meanings are associated with expressions by explicit stipulation in a more expressively powerful semantic metavocabulary, where in model theory you specify the domain and an interpretation function and so on. That's one tradition. Another tradition is an anthropological, natural historical, broadly pragmatist tradition that includes the classical American pragmatists, the early Heidegger of Being and Time, late Wittgenstein. The Tractatus is on the other side, but Investigations is on this side. Quine, when he's wearing his pragmatist hat as opposed to his set theorist's hat. And today we could point to people like Travis. Here we're thinking about language as a distinctive set of social practices, as a striking feature of the natural history of creatures like us, something that we do. In general, I think this tradition is more represented in the continental tradition, but de Saussure and so on, there are structuralists on the other side. Basically, I think these traditions divide on the question whether you should focus on meaning or focus on use. The first one leads to the question, well, what is meaning? And gives you a mathematical structure as the answer. The second one focuses on, is addressing the question, what is discursive practice? What is linguistic practice? And people have different views about that, but one popular common strand is we have to look at the norms for using expressions. Use is a matter of proprieties of use, how it's correct to use things, certainly. This is common to the early Heidegger and the later Wittgenstein. In the terms I'm using here, this is asking whether semantic metavocabularies or pragmatic metavocabularies are more illuminating. And though these two traditions have not had much to say to one another, the logistical semantic tradition has by and large treated pragmatics as an afterthought, doesn't have a general view about discursive practice, but calls on pragmatics when there's stuff that doesn't fit its paradigm and needs to be shoved over there on the pragmatic side. And the pragmatists, including Wittgenstein, including Travis, are not interested in formal semantics or theories of meaning. Sometimes they take their arguments to show that no such thing is possible. This is something we'll talk explicitly about further along when we read chapter 1 of Between Saying and Doing, which is addressing the relation between these in more details. But I'll be taking the position that it's wrong to see these two traditions as presenting us with a choice. They're inviting a synthesis. Let's think about what the relationship is between semantic and pragmatic metavocabularies, between the language we use to make explicit what we're doing when we're talking or thinking, and the language we use to make explicit what we're saying or thinking, the content of it. On the other hand, surely what we want to know is the relations between these. And I'm going to argue that metalinguistic rationalism gives us an illuminating way of synthesizing these perspectives, using them to achieve binocular vision when we see them as principally addressing reasons and different aspects of reasons. Now, here I might pause to say something about the vocabulary that I use. I'm following Rorty in vocabulary is one of his favorite expressions. Middle and late Rorty is all about human beings as having the unique capacity to transform themselves by changing the vocabulary they use to describe themselves and other things. And that's a fascinating undertaking. That's not what I'm going to be addressing. That's not the use of the vocabulary notion that I'm going to Sorry, my robot vacuum cleaner went on there. Rorty's thought started off with Carnap's two-stage account. He says, first, fix your language. Say what the formal calculus is. That'll fix meanings. And then deciding what theory to endorse, determining your beliefs, that'll be settled by the way the world is relative to those meanings. So he envisaged associating the meanings with the expressions of the calculus in an expressively more powerful semantic meta-language. But this was part of the background of his principle of tolerance, his pragmatism about choice of language. He says, look, it's completely up to you what language you find it useful for whatever purposes you have to use. Fix those meanings however you like, but then it won't be up to you. Indeed, you'll be completely constrained by what turns out to be true in the language that you speak. So he sort of divided the authority and responsibility, the normative character of the language, into two realms, one of absolute unconstrained freedom and the other of complete responsibility and lack of freedom, complete determination. Completely free on the side of language, but then the theory that's determined by the way the world is. And Quine, in a series of articles about Carnap, culminating in Two Dogmas of Empiricism, says, look, that makes perfect sense for artificial languages, but there is no distinction like that in natural languages. In natural languages, there's just one thing, the way we use expressions, and that must both fix the meanings and express beliefs and theories. If we're talking about natural languages, we don't find any distinction corresponding to the meaning theory, difference of meaning, difference of belief, language theory or meaning belief. Those distinctions don't apply in natural language. And Rorty suggested, well, if we're going to have to talk without talking about languages and theories, about meanings and beliefs, maybe we should just talk about vocabularies as expressions in use. And though I'll urge we can have a more disciplined and controlled use of the notion of vocabulary than I think Rorty was concerned to have. That's the origin of my use, and I take it to be an advantage that one can talk about logical vocabulary, the vocabulary of logic, conditionals, negation, and so on. One can talk about the vocabulary of physics, where a certain kind of physicalism says, makes a very strong claim about your being able to express everything in the language of physics, in the vocabulary of physics. Corresponding to the notion of language that Carnap was after, I think we can talk about autonomous discursive practices. That's a special kind of vocabulary. To use Wittgenstein's terminology, an autonomous discursive practice is a language game you could play though you played no other, which logical vocabulary is not. I think physical vocabulary is not. Certainly culinary or nautical or theological vocabulary, those are not autonomous discursive practices. Those are fragments that need to be embedded in richer vocabularies in order to have the meanings that they have. But I think we'll find it pays dividends to use the notion of vocabulary in a way that's as elastic as allowing culinary vocabularies and the vocabulary of natural languages as well. So that's why I'll talk about metavocabularies rather than meta languages. Okay. Well, let me pause there to invite questions or comments about the big picture that I've been sort of literally gesturing at here, urging you to focus your mind's eye on the mandala there that will come to be more meaningful. Okay, well, now is probably a good time for us to take a 10-minute break. And so let's come back at 2:18. And I'll drill down a little bit more. Hello, everyone. So I want to say something about the progression from a normative pragmatic metavocabulary to thinking about what I've been calling, without really explaining what I mean by that, reason relations. Now, this pragmatic story we're going to be looking at in more detail next week. And the following week, when you'll hear some contrary voices for next week in the supplementary reading, there's a piece of Ulf Lobel's that's responding to anti-normativists, Gluer, Hati and Gadi, who have argued that it's a mistake to think that meaning is a normative concept. This is downstream from Kripke's Wittgenstein and the rule following considerations. And you can follow out the references and find the original sort of anti-arguments. Ulf's is the anti-anti argument, but there's a literature there that this is a window on, and I'll say something about that then. I'm not going to talk about that now. And then in the second Pragmatics session, 2 weeks from now, in the resources section is a famous article by John McFarlane, another Pitt PhD, been the chair of the Berkeley department for some time now. And though this paper is, in what sense, if any, is logic normative? And one of McFarlane's idiosyncrasies is that he very seldom publishes what he writes. He just sort of puts it out there and people pass it around. His dissertation is one of the most read dissertations. Pitt dissertation is one of the most read dissertations. And Harvard Press begged him to publish it, and he just wouldn't. It's enough that people pass it around in samizdat. And this article on the normativity of logic, but of reasons really more generally, defined an entire literature from it that we'll look at, so that you're not just hearing sort of my side of things, but see something about what other people are writing about. But today, let me introduce the genealogy as I would understand it. Let me recollectively reconstruct the broad outlines of normative, pragmatic metavocabularies. And I see this as going back to Kant. In this course, I'm very seldom going to refer to my hero Hegel and refer to Kant much less than I normally would. But here I think it's inevitable. Kant had the idea that judging, the paradigmatic discursive act for him, and acting intentionally, the sort of practical correlate of judgment for him, technically endorsing a practical maxim, are undertakings of responsibility. In judging, you commit yourself to how things are. In acting, you, in endorsing an intention, commit yourself as to how things are to be or ought to be. What distinguishes knowers and agents from less capable creatures is their capacity to commit themselves, to exercise their authority to make themselves responsible. Authority, responsibility, commitment, these are all normative notions. Kant distinguished us from it, minded creatures from unminded ones, in the sense of rational from irrational, by seeing us as ones who live and move and have our being in a normative space. The basic Kantian normative status, being an autonomous being, is a normative status. It's having the authority to commit yourself, to make yourself responsible by judging and acting. And many of his most characteristic doctrines are consequences of this fundamental normative insight. He saw, for instance, judgments as the smallest unit of responsibility, authority, and commitment. And so broke with the tradition, which had come from below and started with a doctrine of concepts, particular and general, and understood and built on top of that a doctrine of judgments, and built on top of that a doctrine of syllogisms or inferences. He says, no, we've got to start with the judgments. Frege follows up on this thought by thinking of sentences as the smallest unit to which pragmatic force can attach. Pragmatic force being asserting it. And the later Wittgenstein talks about sentences as the smallest linguistic unit you can use to make a move in the language game. But those were, for Kant, the primacy of the judgment. That was a consequence of thinking of us as principally creatures who have the authority to commit ourselves. And concepts for him, then, he describes as functions of judgment. They determine what we've made ourselves responsible for. And so he says they're rules. And we can think of judgment as binding ourselves by these rules. When I say that the coin is copper, the concept copper determines the content of my commitment, what I've committed myself to. Judging is binding ourselves by rules which are concepts. And this was a revolutionary thought. The pre-Kantian tradition had thought about the contents of ideas in terms of our grip on them. Is it clear? Is it distinct? Do I have an adequate idea? And Kant turns that on his head and says, no, the question is their grip on us. How is it that I can bind myself by a concept so that when I apply the concept copper and say the coin is copper, I have, whether I know it or not, committed myself to its conducting electricity and it's melting at 1,084 degrees centigrade. But how is it possible for me to bind myself by this norm, subject myself to the rule? What is it to exercise that authority, to bind myself? And so the notion of bindingness, Verbindlichkeit, of validity, the Gültigkeit, again, that's a variant of the bindingness. What becomes problematic, the subject of philosophical explanation, is our capacity to bind ourselves, to commit ourselves by rules. So instead of dividing us from it in the Cartesian way, by thinking of there being two kinds of stuff, and what distinguishes us is the mind stuff, where events of thinking or judging and willing take place, Kant sees a distinction between the world as non-normatively specified and the world as normatively specified, the world as specified in terms of commitments and authority and responsibility. Now, this is also where reasons come in, but I'll leave that thread to one side for the moment. His follower Hegel comes along and says, you're right, Kant, normativity is the issue. What's the difference between things that are subject to norms and things that aren't? Kant had said, well, everything is subject to laws, but we're subject to authority only in virtue of our attitudes, of our acknowledgement. We're binding ourselves. The stone that you throw accelerates toward the earth at 32 feet per second. It didn't bind itself in that way. It just is bound. But we are autonomous. We have the capacity to bind ourselves. But from Hegel's point of view, Kant advanced things by distinguishing normative from non-normative rather than mental from physical. But he was in serious danger of erecting a new dualism of the normative and the non-normative in the place of the Cartesian dualism. And in fact, if you look at in some places inspiring, in other places sorry history of subsequent neo-Kantianism, for instance, as Fred Beiser tells us that story, he argues persuasively, I think, that was the rock on which the neo-Kantian project foundered in the 19th century, that they took this idea of us as the creatures who were subject to norms and ran with it, but in the end were unable to avoid a dualism of the sort that gives you Diltaian exceptionalism about normative creatures as well as specifically discursive ones. And Hegel's constructive response to his diagnosis of this dualistic danger in Kant's insight into the normative character of discursiveness, of apperception, of sapience, was to bring that distinction down to earth and give a social practice account of normativity in terms of reciprocal recognition. And if you're interested, I tell that story in various places, but the version of that matters most to us is the later Wittgenstein, who takes up this notion of what's distinctive of us. He wouldn't say as rational creatures, but happy enough to say as discursive ones, as language users, as the players of Sprachspiel. That the distinction is normative. And so for instance, a characteristic Wittgensteinian anecdote, he says, the mother asks you to amuse the children while she does something in the next room. She says, teach the children a game. And when she comes back 45 minutes later, you're all down on your knees rolling dice for money. You've taught them to gamble with dice. And she's horrified. She says, I didn't mean that kind of game. And Wittgenstein says, and what she says is exactly right. She did not mean that kind of game. That was not an appropriate response to her request. It was not a response that fulfilled her request, that satisfied the norm that her request embodied. But, he says, it may very well be, probably is, that she didn't think explicitly, well, I don't mean gambling. That thought didn't cross her mind. And yet, he says, it is the right thing to say what she says. I didn't mean that kind of game. But how is that possible? How could the meaning of her request, where that is a kind of game, after all, semantically, that is a kind of game. How could it be that that request carved out a normative space, distinguishing what would be an appropriate fulfillment of the request and what would not, that drew this line in a place that isn't semantically drawn by the word she used, game, games of chance are games, and was not drawn by anything that consciously went through her mind? Isn't that mysterious? He says. And of course, his diagnostic intent is to show us what we've presupposed that makes that seem mysterious. But I use this example from the investigations because he's there focusing on the normativity of discursiveness. In this case, not judgment, but a request. But you can see how this goes through for an intention, for a belief, and so on. And Wittgenstein, sharpens this when he asks us about the norm of guidance of a signpost, where one is correctly responding to the signpost by following it on this path, not, for instance, following it from the finger to the arm of the post. But what is it about that that says that? He contrasts the signpost with that same signpost considered just as a piece of wood that is described in a resolutely non-normative vocabulary. And though the details are vastly controversial, and John McDowell and I would tell different stories about this, everybody can agree that his answer is to look to the social practices, the customs, uses, institutions, he says, surrounding responses to signposts, and in particular to the way we teach people to respond to signposts and respond to their responses and so on. He's giving a social practice perspective as an alternative to the perspective that makes it just seem mysterious and magical somehow, that we can imbue objects, the signpost considered just as a piece of wood, with normative properties. So Wittgenstein, without learning the lesson from Hegel, seconds the idea that the way to bring Kantian normativity down to earth, for Kant, the norms lived in the noumenal realm, not in the empirical realm. That's why there's the danger of the dualism. But to bring them down to earth by giving a social practice account of them, however that goes. And here, I think it's salutary to keep in mind a bon mot of Stanley Cavell, epitomizing this strand in the history of philosophy, saying Kant de-psychologized epistemology. Psychologism is what Frege had talked about, the non-normativists. Kant criticizes the one he calls the celebrated Mr. Locke for having provided a mere physiology of the understanding, an account of the causal processes that lead to knowledge or to error, but without distinguishing the question of fact from the question of right, the quid facti from the quid juris, without asking the normative question about the authority that's claimed by claims to knowledge, possessed by genuine knowledge. So he de-psychologized it, that is, acknowledged the normative character of epistemology, of knowledge. So Cavell says Kant de-psychologized epistemology. Frege de-psychologized logic. Logic was a normative discipline. And Wittgenstein de-psychologized psychology. Psychological states like intending, meaning, claiming, requesting, and so on. So Kant de-psychologized epistemology, Frege de-psychologized logic, and Wittgenstein de-psychologized psychology. Well, all of these thinkers are at least inviting us, encouraging us to think about discursive practice as a normative practice, as a normative matter, which I'm urging we think of as saying, unless the pragmatic metavocabulary you use, the language you use to talk about the use of linguistic expressions, unless that's a normative metavocabulary, or at least supports normative descriptions of what we're doing, you're going to miss key phenomena, phenomena that are important for the semantics. When the mother says, "I didn't mean that kind of game," she's talking about the meaning expressed by her request. Now, it's controversial whether one can make sense of norms implicit in social practice apart from making sense of discursive norms implicit in social practice. In making it explicit, I offer a layer cake picture. I argue you can make sense of implicitly normative practices that are not yet linguistic practices, so that there's a substantive question as to what distinguishes the subset of implicitly normative practices that are discursive practices. This is not a distinction that the German idealists accept. For them, norms are discursive norms. They are conceptual norms. All of them are. And John McDowell follows them in this regard. Says, you can't make sense of the content of the norm unless it is, in the end, a conceptual content, and so something only intelligible in the context of discursive practice. So, there's an issue there about whether we're talking about a proper subset of implicitly normative practices that are the discursive ones or not. But we can still ask, well, what makes them discursive? What makes them contentful? Whether that's all of the normative practices or just some of them. And here, Wittgenstein is very relaxed and agreeable. His Sprachspiel, little vocabularies, expressions in use that he uses to make various philosophical points. He's happy to say that there are not only norms involved in them, but that they are Sprachspiel, language games. And emphasizes that by saying language does not have a downtown. There's no central set of practices in virtue of the relation to which other practices count as discursive practices. It's sort of all suburbs. This vocabulary is used, this other vocabulary is used. They rub up against each other at the edges in contingent and unpredictable ways. It's a motley. That's the Wittgensteinian picture. But I'll argue that language does have a downtown, that what it is for something to be a discursive practice is for some performances in it to have the pragmatic significance of assertions, of claimings, of sayings that things are thus and so. In working out the successor bilateralist framework that we use in the Reasons and Logic book, I'll talk even-handedly about assertions and denials, expressing the acceptance and the rejection of claims. And that's going to do a lot of work, roughly the work that the distinction between truth values of true and false does in a semantics first order of explanation. But for now, I'm not going to talk about that. My thought already in making it explicit was that what's distinctive of a discursive practice is that you can say something in it. And saying something is making a claim. There's an iron triangle of discursiveness that has at the pragmatic side of it, this distinctive speech act of assertion or claiming. And at the syntactic end, the expressions that you use to assert or claim something are sentences, declarative sentences, the paradigm kind of sentence. And at the semantic end, those are what express propositional contents, which, following Kant's primacy of the judgment, are the principal kind of conceptual content. I'm not going to argue for that now. We'll look at some of that later. In the reading for this week, I put an essay on asserting that gives some arguments for that. But if that's right, then Wittgenstein's strictly wrong to think that his various Sprachspiel are genuinely linguistic practices. The slab Sprachspiel, for instance, doesn't have any assertions in it. It only has what amount to orders, though Wittgenstein just calls them calls. Ruf is the term that he uses. My claim is you can't have orders, imperatives in a language that doesn't have assertions in it. Nothing can mean shut the door unless something can mean the door is shut. The contents of other speech acts are ultimately derivative from the speech acts of that are assertable, from assertional speech acts. And that assertion has this normatively double-barreled character that Kant already noticed, that in asserting, I'm doing two things. I'm undertaking a responsibility, undertaking a commitment, which we could operationalize by saying, if you challenge me on it, anyway, if it's an appropriate challenge, I'm committing myself to being able to give a reason for it, to justify the claim. There's an implicit justificatory responsibility in making an assertion. And I'm exercising an authority. I'm authorizing you to make inferences from this claim that I've made, deferring your justificatory responsibility to me. If somebody challenges you for the claim, you say, well, I just believed what Bob said. If you want to know what reasons, what evidence there is for that, ask him. That is, assertion and inference are two sides of one coin. It doesn't make sense to think of a speech act of saying how things are without a speech act of justifying that or challenging it, giving a reason for it, or in a challenge, giving a reason against it. What you're doing in the responsibility you undertake is to respond to challenges like that by justifying. If somebody gives you a reason against it, you're implicitly committing yourself to giving a reason for it, on pain of losing the authority that you were otherwise granting to people to testimonially appeal to your authority. That is, if I'm a third-person scorekeeper and I look at your claim and somebody makes a justified challenge to it, gives a good reason against it, and you can't come back with a reason for it, then I'm not going to acknowledge that your claim authorizes other people to make the same claim. You forfeited, at least temporarily, the authority that otherwise by default you got for making the claim. So I claim that the Sprachspiel that don't include this structure of giving and asking for reasons are really, they're vocal, there are noises exchanged, but they're not really verbal. They're not really linguistic. They are so only in a parasitic secondary way. A way of putting this is that any autonomous discursive practice, any language game you could play though you played no other, any language game you could play though you played no other, must be such as to institute on some speech acts, on some performances, the pragmatic significance of claiming that things are thus and so, understood in terms of its inferential relations to what, on the one hand, are reasons for it, and on the other hand, what it can serve as a reason for and a reason against. Now, it's in this context that Gil Harman, one of my teachers at Princeton many years ago, in a vastly influential paper, made what has always remained for me the Harman point. He makes a number of points in the essay, so not everyone recognizes the definite article. He made this in the form of a characteristically outrageous philosophical claim about logic, but we'll see it carries over to reasons. That claim was, there is no such thing as deductive inference. How could that be? I mean, we have logic. If there were such a thing as deductive inference, presumably a paradigm of it would be, if you have as premises P and the conditional if P then Q, then infer Q. That's licensed by modus ponens. That it's licensed is at least intimately tied up with the meaning of the conditional. Surely, if there's a deductive inference, an inference with modus ponens from premises P and if P then Q to Q, if you believe P and you believe if P then Q, then you should believe Q. But he says, but that would be a terrible inference or a terrible pattern of inference to endorse in general. You might have much better reasons against Q than you had for either P or if P then Q. And if that were true, what you should do is give up when you see that Q is a consequence, then you should give up either P or the conditional. He says, that's what it would be if there was such a thing as deductive inference. Because what there is, as a practice, inferring, moving from one commitment to another commitment, or one commitment inheriting entitlement from other commitments. He says, but that's not what logic is about, what deduction is about. It's not about inference. There's an implication relation between P, if P then Q, and Q. But all that tells you is that you shouldn't believe all of P, if P then Q, and not Q. But it doesn't tell you what to do in a particular case. You've still got options. There's a relation that's codified in the conditional and, let's say, in the negation. There's an implication relation which constrains what you should do, but it doesn't determine it. So the Harman point is that you should distinguish between practices of inferring, something you do, and relations of implication, which bear a relation, a constraining relation to the norms of inferring practices of inference, but have a looser relation to it. Well, that's the Harman point, that if we start off thinking about discursive practices and we see that they need to be, in order to be discursive practices, they need to be assertional practices, and they can't be assertional practices unless they're practices of giving and asking for reasons for and against. The constellation of normative statuses of authority and responsibility, and the interpersonal way in which the function of assertion is to give premises for inference to people who weren't in a position to make the original assertion by testimony. That whole picture of discursive practice requires us to think about reason relations of implication, abstracted from those practices or postulated in order to make sense of the norms. Well, we're going to be concerned about those. That's that first upward arrow going from the pragmatics to the reason relations, relations of implication, and relations of incompatibility, where when we get to the logic, the implication relations are codified explicitly in conditionals, and the relations of incompatibility are codified explicitly in negation. So those become the fundamental sentential logical connectives, and/or I usually dismiss as Boolean helper monkeys. I mean, we'll see why they're there, but they're not codifying reason relations directly. They're part of the syncategorematic machinery needed to let the conditional and negation do that codification. That's now talking about the vertical arrow coming from the central reason relations up to the logic. This Harman point is important, and if you're interested in tracking down the original, McFarlane sort of starts with the Harman point in his article that we read 2 weeks from now, so you can drill down through his references to find the Harman. Is there anything anybody wants to say about that sort of bite-sized bit? Okay, that's suggesting a path from a normative pragmatics to a notion of reason. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a question about something you mentioned. I think, I'm not sure in which reading, but you mentioned that there can be rational creatures which aren't logical. And I guess that has to do with the sort of move from the semantics to the relation between the semantics and the pragmatics. But just thinking about it intuitively, it's hard to imagine someone who can understand, like, who's rational, who can recognize what's a reason for what without understanding the logical connection between those two propositions.
Okay, good. That's a good, deep question, and thereon hangs a tale. And the question of whether one can be a rational creature without being a logical creature is one that, I don't know, it cuts at a lot of important joints. It divides me and John McDowell, for instance, where he flatly denies that that's an intelligible situation. His slogan for that is the light dawns slowly over the whole. And as one gets a better grip on the rational, one gets a better grip on the logical, but it all comes together is his picture. But this is exactly the next question that arises, particularly if we think about moving, okay, so I've at least gestured at how we get to the middle of the triangle, to the reason relations. Now what about the logic, where, anyway, a tradition in the philosophy of logic took it that the principal questions in the philosophy of logic were two: the demarcation question and the correctness question. So the demarcation question, what distinguishes logical vocabulary from other vocabulary, or logical concepts from other concepts, if one's talking that way. Here they're looking over their shoulders at the question of whether the set theoretic epsilon, the set membership operator, if you say that's logic, that's a bit of logical vocabulary, then the possibility, the program of reducing arithmetic to logic becomes doable in a way that it's not clearly doable if you don't. But how should we decide whether that's a bit of logical vocabulary? Or Quine wanting to argue that modal operators are not properly logical operators. That's a matter of the demarcation question. And then the correctness question, what's the right logic? And there they're looking over their shoulders. This strand in the philosophy of logic at the 20th century wars between classical logicians and intuitionistic logicians that disagree about the validity of some inferences. We're going to lightly touch on that when we do it logic. It's not going to be at the center. So in the 60s, both Quine and Putnam wrote books called What is Logic? Called The Philosophy of Logic. Sorry, same title for both of them that agreed on these. But I think there's a question upstream from that, a deeper, more fundamental question about logic that the philosophy of logic needs to start with. And that's the question of what the relationship is between logic and reasons. And here there are two principal approaches, I think. Much of the tradition, at least in the philosophy of logic, has been logic first, reason second. The point of doing logic is to understand the notion of reasons. Good reasons, at least in the theoretical realm, are logically good reasons. All good reasons are at base logically good. In some sense, behind every good reason, there's a logically valid form of inference. Maybe we need to treat the good inference that we start with as enthymematic, that is not making explicit all of its premises. So in the case that Sellers begins with, if I say it's raining, so the streets will be wet, this logistical tradition says that is a good inference, but it has a suppressed premise, and the suppressed premise is if it's raining, then the streets will be wet. And if you throw that in, it's raining, and if it's raining, then the streets will be wet, then the conclusion the streets will be wet. Now we've got an instance of modus ponens. Put brackets around Harmon for this discussion. And logic articulates the missing premises. that need to be added to turn a rough and ready but enthymematic good inference into a genuinely good one. But the line we're developing, the role group research on logical expressivism, turns that on its head and says, look, in the beginning were materially good inferences, like the inference from it's raining to the streets will be wet, or lightning now, so thunder soon. From Pittsburgh is to the west of New York, so New York is to the east of Pittsburgh. The goodness of those inferences articulates part of the content of concepts like rain and wet, lightning and thunder, east and west, being able to make moves like that to grasp implications, reason relations like that, is part of what grasping the content of those non-logical concepts consists in. And it's perfectly intelligible that you should do that first without yet having the capacity to say that the implication from A is to the west of B to B is to the east of A is a good one by using the conditional to say if this, or to say if A is to the east of B, then B is not to the west of A. Well, you know those are incompatible commitments, or you don't understand east and west, that A is to the east of B and B is to the east of A, that those are incompatible. That's part of understanding the cardinal directions, even if you didn't have the capacity to make that incompatibility explicit using using not. So that is an argument for anything that's saying people do go both ways at this point. The tradition, by and large, has understood goodness of reasons as logical goodness of reasons. We can see a non-trivial variant of that in rational choice theory that also gives us an analysis of good reasons, but now on the practical side, and says the form of a good practical reason is always a maximizing reason, that it would maximize utility. And so, if we just understand decision theory and game theory, we'll know what good reasons are. And I think both of these reductive programs, the one on the theoretical side with logic, one on the practical side with rational choice theory, and let me throw in the Bayesian version of decision theory there too. I mean, they have they are defining tractable and important notions of rationality, but it cannot be the general notion of a good reason, because they presuppose the semantic contents of the things that are engaged in these things, the propositions that stand in these relations. So in any sort of decision theoretic framework, you're presupposing the content of the options and the outcomes over which you're defining preferences and probabilities. I can't resist mentioning that the easiest way to show that you're an idiot is to rehearse this slogan you'll often hear from politicians: failure is not an option. Yeah, right. It's not an option, it's an outcome. And the distinction between options that you get to choose and outcomes, which is what happens downstream, is the very beginning of rational thinking in this vicinity. So, don't be that person. Anyway, the content of the options and the outcomes, that's presupposed. You can't understand, if we need to articulate those contents in terms of their role in reasoning, it can't be their role in this kind of reasoning. There must be some broader antecedent notion. Now, you might give a different kind of semantic story, but that's the way things are going to look from the logical expressivist and semantic inferentialist point of view. So that upward arrow going from the reason relations to the logic is an expressivist arrow. It's saying we're going to understand logical vocabulary as introduced to codify proprieties of material, that is non-logical, pre-logical reasoning, where we think of those reasons in terms of the role they play in relations of implication and incompatibility. I haven't at all argued that or even really said anything to indicate why those should be the two flavors of reason relations, but I'm issuing lots of promissory notes like that. And then the arrow that goes from the reason relations to the semantics, preferred order of semantic explanation is an inferentialist semantics, thinking in terms of the contents that are conferred on expressions by the relations they play in the roles they play with respect to relations of implication and incompatibility. Now, here's another piece of the puzzle that has to do with the core, with the reason relations. And that is that because people were logicists about reasons, that is, thought that good reasons meant logically good reasons, at least in the theoretical realm. But as I've said, there's an exactly parallel move in the practical realm, even though we're not going to go there. They thought that reason relations in general must have the properties that logical reason relations have. And Tarski, in a classic 1930s paper on the concept of logical consequence, and Gensen in a piece we'll actually, anyway, that I linked to for our talk about his sequent calculi, endorses the same principles. In logic, if some set of premises gamma implies A, then you can throw anything else you want into the premise side. Gamma together with any arbitrary X also implies A. That's monotonicity. In the way Tarski puts it, he's thinking about a set X of premises and the set C of X of its consequences. And he says, well, we've got a principle of containment that says the premises are consequences. So X is a subset of C of X. And if X is a subset of Y, then C of X is a subset of C of Y. That's monotonicity. And the consequences of X are just the same as the consequences of X. That's transitivity. And that's enough to make consequence or implication a topological closure operator, so we can talk about closing our beliefs under logical consequence. And if you're a logicist about the relation between logic and reasons, you think, well, then reason relations must have that same form. But they don't. Ordinary reasoning is not always monotonic and it's not always transitive. We'll look at particular examples of that, and we'll look at fundamental reasons to think, well, it couldn't really be, have those formal properties. But if not, what logic should we have to codify these substructural, or since it's not a closure operator, open textured, open structured reason relations? And that was the specific question that I charged the logic group with addressing. I said, look, there is not a good way of doing this now because people have not thought of logics in the expressivist way as having the job of codifying semantogenic pre-logical reason relations. They just haven't looked hard. And for various reasons that we'll talk about, though lots of people are worried about non-monotonic logics and less, but recently there's been a good bit of work on non-transitive logics. They're actually asking a somewhat different question, how you can start with a classical logic and do something to it to make it non-monotonic and non-transitive, rather than asking how you can have a logic that lets you make explicit non-monotonic and non-transitive reason relations. And that's the solution that's what Dan has decisively solved that problem, following up on a system of Wolff's that Wolff solved it for supra-intuitionist systems, and Dan solved it for supra-classical ones in a way that showed the generally how it worked. So in our 2 weeks on logic, we're going to look at those alternatives to contemporary non-monotonic logics that I claim have considerable practical application for inference engines clamped onto databases, where, again, for many reasons, you don't want to insist on a closure structure. So, look, in the course, we're going to pursue a reasons-first approach to language that says that reasons are the heart and the form of language, that understands logic as a distinctive kind of language of reasons. And by looking at the relation between the reason relations of some autonomous discursive vocabulary, discursive practice or vocabulary at the ground level, and the reason relations of pragmatic, semantic, and logical metavocabularies for expressing features of those reason relations, we're going to get an account of what it is to be a vocabulary that the claim is picks out the very same languages that an interpretivist model would. That is, that any vocabulary that has these features, that exhibits reason relations that admit of just this constellation of rational metavocabularies, that all and only such things are interpretable, are vocabularies in that hermeneutic sense. So looking slightly more specifically, in the pragmatics portion, we'll take what to my mind is the most sophisticated contemporary pragmatics for a logical vocabulary, Restall and Ripley's bilateralism, and enriching it we can get a compelling account of what relations of implication and incompatibility mean for pre-logical reason relations. So that's that first arrow from the pragmatics to the semantics. And along the way, we'll look at two contemporary controversies that we can, I'm claiming, clean up. I mean, the debate about the normativity of logic and the debate about the normativity of meaning. And then in discussing the reason relations, we'll look at arguments for the open structure of reason relations in general, and then move to the logic and look at this particular sequent calculus, multi-subsequent sequent calculus, that lets you express arbitrary open structured reason relations. And then looking at the semantics, look at the implication space semantics that shows in rigorous detail how to represent the propositional contents of arbitrary expressions in terms of the reason relations they stand in. And we'll show the relation between that, a relation of isomorphism, if you define the consequence relation in the right way, the isomorphism between that semantics and Fine's hyperintentional truth-maker semantics. So that's the material from the sort of Pitt student book that we will rehearse. And then in the last section of the course, after we're done with what's epitomized in the mandala, there's another series of considerations about the relation between broadly alethic modal semantic metavocabularies and deontic normative pragmatic metavocabularies that doesn't particularly have to do with logic or this detailed semantics, but does have to do with saying what the representational or descriptive dimension of reasons and the contents that reasons confer is. And that's less well worked out. It's sort of more, even more gestural. My claim is that, well, anyway, my belief is the reason we're writing this book is we've figured out the details, how to work out this metalinguistic rationalism in all four parts, the three vertices in the center of the mandala. But these other things are tantalizing and suggestive directions to go from there. So we will be touching ground with other literatures at each of these points. But on the whole, I'll be trying to tell a story from the point of view that I've sketched, starting at 10,000 feet up and getting a little bit closer to the ground today. Okay. Well, as I said partway in, if you want to get an overview of the project, that long manuscript on the structure of reasons is there, or you can go through and look at the the bits of the draft of the book to be that are there. I greatly hope that we'll have more chapter drafts by the time we actually get to that point in the book. Dan is working as well as he can. He's writing chapter 2. And so I'm hoping we'll have that. If not, he and Ulf will tell us stories about it. So, okay, well, that's fine then. Plunge in. The distinction between what I've asked you to read and what is supplementary, that's really pretty important. There's a lot of supplementary stuff there. It's good stuff. I'll be talking about it. But I'll try and, I'm trying to make good judgments as to what, it's worth actually reading. You see, there's a big synoptic view about language and logic. But at least for the task of achieving binocular vision with respect to more traditional ways, which will always be our foil, I think it's immensely valuable, and that there are lots of connections to other issues in philosophy and areas of philosophy, if you think about language and logic from this perspective. Well then, I will see you next week. If you think that you might want to keep coming back, why don't you drop me a note just so I have your email address in case I have to send out a notice to everybody about something, so we're all on the same page. Just an email saying you think you might want to come to some more of these. Okay. Thank you very much then. Be safe.